Hello everyone, and welcome to our weekly webinar for Sociology 111. This week we're going to be covering Chapter 14, the family and intimate relationships. We'll be taking a global look at the family, examining different family styles and types. We'll examine sociological perspectives on the family, take a look at marriage in the family. We'll take a look at divorce, diverse lifestyles, and finally we'll wrap up with looking at social policy in the family, gay marriage. Some of the things that we're going to be addressing in this, what are families in different parts of the world like? How do people select mates? When a marriage fails, how does the divorce affect the children? And what are the alternatives to the nuclear family, and how prevalent are they? Okay. Family is one of what we would call a cultural universal. It's a social institution that exists in all cultures, but it varies from culture to culture. How the family is constructed, what roles there are in the family, what responsibilities various family members have. One of the definitions is a nuclear family. Now, nuclear family is what we hear referred to a lot of times in political rhetoric as a traditional family. This is the father, the mother, and the children. It's a married couple and unmarried children living together in the household. And this is the core on which larger family groups are based. Extended family, this is when you have multiple generations, or you may have married siblings with their children in the same household. So it's a family in which more than just the married parents and children are living in the same household. You would have other relatives, perhaps grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, this type of a setup. When we talk about patterns of marriage, there are a number of different ways that we can kind of create family units. The one that's prevalent here in the United States of America is monogamy, and this is a form of marriage in which there are only two people. Traditionally, a man and a woman would unite and are married only to each other. People may think that's the norm here in the United States of America. What we actually practice could better be described as serial monogamy. And this is the idea that we have only one partner at a time, but we do not have a lifelong relationship with one partner. You have several spouses in his or her lifetime, but only one spouse at a time. And that's actually closer to the pattern here in the United States of America. For people who have been married, the average number of times they've been married in the U.S. is 2, indicating that of people who have been married, they've had at least one divorce. Other ways that families can be arranged is polygamy. Now, this is when there are several husbands or wives simultaneously. An individual is married to more than one person at a time. And there are a couple of different types of polygamy. There's polygyny, and that's what is practiced here in the United States of America by certain extreme sects of the Church of Latter-day Saints, such as the Fundamentalist Church of Latter-day Saints. And that is when a man is married to more than one woman at a time. There's also polyandry, and this is when a woman is married to more than one husband at the same time. Polygyny has existed in various cultures throughout history. No recorded history has any kind of records of polyandry other than anecdotal. There is no society that left written records who practiced polyandry. But polyandry is One of the ways in which families can arrange, there's anecdotal evidence that maybe some Native American tribes practiced polyandry here in the United States of America. It may have been practiced in some of the Pacific Islands, according to some written records. But there's actually no society that left its own written records that indicates it practiced polyandry. Now, of course, marriage is one of the ways that we establish kinship. Kinship is the idea of being related to other people, either by blood or through some other type of legal arrangement. Marriage is a legal arrangement that actually creates kinship. Another way would be adoption. So, we trace our heritage based upon kinship. Kind of a bloodline tracing. Now, again, there are a number of ways that we can trace kinship patterns. First of all is bilateral descent. We see this practiced in certain cultures, not necessarily in our own culture here in the United States of America, but among certain Hispanic cultures. When you hear a name like somebody say Gabriel Garcia Vega, Garcia is one family name and Vega is the other family name, and it's actually, I believe, the first is the father's name, the second is the mother's name, but the hyphenated Spanish surnames are actually bilateral descent being traced, and it's tracing both the father and the mother's name traditionally. And then this is when you see both sides of a person's family being regarded, both parts of a person's heritage being regarded as important. So when we see those hyphenated last names, and it has become a practice among certain people in the U.S. to hyphenate the last name upon marriage, and this is tracing both of the family names. My cousin, when she got married, her surname was Powers. My uncle Pat married my brother's sister, Evelyn. Well, he wasn't my uncle until he did that, but that created kinship between us. His last name was Powers. Her husband's last name is Murphy, and they go by a hyphenate, Powers Murphy, or Murphy Powers. I think they alternate. I think that he is Sean Murphy Powers, and she is Jennifer Powers Murphy. But they have hyphenated their last name. Now, the traditional way of doing it in most European societies, and America is a Euro heritage society, is patrilineal descent. And that's when you trace it through the father's bloodlines. You know, the fact that my name is Howell, my father's name was Howell, my grandfather's name was Howell, great-grandfather's name was Howell. And even though there are Ledbetters, there are Boltons, there are other family names in my genealogy, the only one that I was given upon birth was Howell. And that would be tracing patrilineal descent. The opposite side of this, of course, would be matrilineal descent, in which the mother's heritage is traced, and only the mother's relatives are important. Now, when you look at patrilineal descent being prevalent, it indicates that most societies that we know of in the world are what would be referred to as patriarchal societies. And in patriarchy, it is the male gender that is the dominant gender. It is the males that make the family decisions. Males hold the power in a family. Opposed to this, of course, would be matriarchy, in which women would be the ones making the decisions. Again, in recorded history, where there is actually written records of history, all the societies we have that have left written records have been patriarchies. There is some indication that a society like the Celtic society, which is the society that predates a lot of the current residents in Scotland, Ireland, Wales, there were actually Spanish Celts and French Celts as well that predated the arrival of the later Europeans, the Franks, the Angles, the Saxons, etc. But there is some evidence that Celtic society was a matriarchy in which women had greater authority than men. However, they did not leave written records, so this is based primarily on writings from the Romans around the time that they began encountering the Celts, when the Roman Empire moved into Western Europe and then eventually into Great Britain, where they founded Londinium, which later became London. But there are no societies that have really left written records that indicate that they practiced matriarchy. Now, how does this relate to the family? Well, patriarchy in the family means that the father makes all the decisions. Matriarchy means that the mother makes all the decisions. Opposing this, something that's becoming more and more accepted as the way things should be here in the United States of America, is the egalitarian family, in which both partners participate equally in the decision-making regarding finances, regarding children. Both partners participate in the decision-making, and they come to a consensus on what the proper decision is. And this is termed an egalitarian family. Okay, now when we look at families, of course, we have to look at them from our theoretical approaches: functionalism, conflict, and symbolic interaction. Those are the three major approaches in sociology. So, from the functionalist perspective, there are functions that the family serves as a social institution in society. One is reproduction. We get new family or new members of society from family. Family is the only social institution responsible for the production of new members of society. Family is also responsible for the early socialization of those new members. But we do not live in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where they had factories producing children, where you would see the economy actually, from the functionalist perspective, then the economy would be responsible for social reproduction. In our society, it's the family that's responsible for social reproduction. Protection. The family is also the primary unit that is responsible for the protection of those new members. The family is responsible for ensuring that the new members of society have shelter from the elements. That's not something that other institutions in society are really required to take care of. Some of them may, but it's really upon the family to make sure that there's shelter from the elements. As I said, the early socialization of those new members of society falls upon the family. Of course, regulation of sexual behavior. This is really what would be another cultural universal, which is one of the cultural universal taboos: incest. Family actually does provide regulation of sexual behavior. First of all, there's a certain age at which children are ready for sexual activity, and there's a cultural norm that determines that age. In our society, for the most part, it's 18. However, as far as the regulation of sexual behavior, the incest taboo says you're related to somebody, not really acceptable to look at them as a potential spouse to start a family for purposes of sexual reproduction. Now, brother, sister, parents, children, these are illegal at a federal level. There's no state where it's permissible to marry your brother or your sister or your mother or your father for the purpose of starting a family. But how many of you out there get a little shiver when I say, what about your first cousin? I bet some of you probably feel that might be a little bit beyond the pale. However, just so you know, there are a number of states, I want to say it's about 24 states, where first cousins are allowed to marry. 4 of those states do place a regulation on it that they really should be beyond the age of starting a family. So I believe the arbitrary age is 40, 45, something like that. But that means that there are 20 states where you can marry your first cousin to start a family. in the United States of America. And contrary to popular stereotypes, those are not concentrated in the South. A lot of them happen to be in the northeastern seaboard. Affection and companionship. The family is also, initially responsible for effective nurturing what you would call expressive tasks for new children. New children, in order to be socialized properly, must receive affection and companionship. We need to be, we're social creatures. So family also provides that as a function. You know how they always say blood is thicker than water? Well, what that really means is that the bonds you have with your family are the strongest bonds you have. And then, of course, provision of social status. If you are born into certain families, that provides higher status, other families that will provide lower status. But where your family ranks in society is what would be called your entry point or origin into society. And as Max Weber said, this determines your life chances to a certain extent. But from a functionalist perspective, your family provides your initial social status. You may do things to change it once you achieve maturity, but where you rank in society initially is determined by your family. Okay, conflict view is a little bit different. Family reflects inequality in wealth and power found within society. There are a few ways that family does this. First of all, as I said, every society with recorded history has been some form of patriarchy. So husbands have exercised power and authority within the family. Traditionally, males have dominated the family as a social institution. There are other ways as well. When we talk about view family as an economic unit that contributes to social injustice, Karl Marx basically said that family is just another social institution that reproduces social inequality. How does family do this? Through the practice of inheritance. By allowing people to pass on vast amounts of wealth to their children, we perpetuate and reproduce social injustice. And if you think that that may sound a little outrageous, let me just ask a question and think about this. What did Paris Hilton do, or Nikki Hilton, to deserve the vast fortune they have? They didn't really earn it, did they? And with regards to Paris Hilton, everybody said, well, she has a music career, she has an acting career, she has, reality TV career. The question becomes, would any of that happen for her without her fortune? Did her fortune make her career possible, or did her career make her fortune possible? Just something to think about when you think about the conflict perspective on family, an economic unit that contributes to social injustice. The practice of inheritance is what allows that to happen. Marx believed that the accumulation of wealth by any one person was theft from everyone else in society. And by being allowed to pass on the results of that theft, you're just continuing social inequality and perpetuating social inequality. Okay, finally we have the interactionist view on family. This, of course, remember the symbolic interactionist view is that micro-level approach where we're looking at the effect on individuals. So what we're looking at here is how family as an institution shapes the interactions and shapes the meaning of interactions between members of the family. When you say my father, or you say my mother, or you say my brother, or you say my sister, you're describing a relationship that instantly carries some level of meaning to anybody else in our society. They instantly understand the nature of that relationship. They may not understand all of the particulars of it, but they understand the nature of that relationship just from using those terms. So that's how the meaning or how the relationship is constructed by the family. Now, a lot of the focus, of course, is looking how those roles shape the interaction between individuals, whether it's cohabitation, whether it's marriage, whatever type of marriage it may be, monogamous, polygamous, homogamous, which is another way we can talk about family in terms of homogamy, which is the tendency to marry people who are similar to us, and that's not the same as homosexual orientation. Homogamy refers to education, class, race. We tend to actually marry people who are very similar to us. They say opposites attract, and that may be true, but opposites don't make for long-term committed relationships. What you have to have are some complementary differences, but you also have to have some commonalities in there. Finally, we get to the feminist perspective, and this, again, looks at family as a social institution. Feminism, remember, wants us to treat the female perspective as legitimate and valuable in and of itself, not just as how it differs from being male. And in early sociology, there was a tendency to view everything from the perspective of how it differed from what we would call the invisible norm, which is being white and male in U.S. society. And so what feminism wants people to understand is that just because there's not automatically, or there's no adult male, that's not automatically cause for concern. If we're going to make a claim like that, we better be able to back it up with research. And right now, to be honest with you, research really hasn't demonstrated that having two heterosexual parents actually contributes any better to the socialization of children. If you have two parents in a household and they're in a loving, committed, supportive relationship, children have better outcomes. But if you have two heterosexual parents in a household and they are fighting constantly, children come out of those with some type of psychological damage often. So we can't automatically say that not having an adult male in a household, the children are not going to be socialized properly, because if there is an adult male in the household and there's abuse going on, children are not going to be socialized properly. We have to look at the individual context of what's going on before we can make any judgment. So we need to really do research and have evidence to back up what the claims that we're going to make, and we also need to investigate, according to feminism, neglected topics. You know, how does family perpetuate social inequality gender-wise, like a gender inequality? You know, we have to kind of look at that, because in colonial times, a family was a unit that in which both parents, male and female, participated in the economic production, which would be the instrumental tasks of the family, and both parents participated in the expressive task for the family, which was the emotional caring and nurturing of the children. You can find colonial primers for fathers on how to bond with their children, how all, you know, guides about child rearing and child care, things like that. It wasn't until the industrial age came along and separated out the economic center of a family from the home, relegating the economic production for the family into the public sphere and the expressive or emotional part caring for the family into the private sphere. It's the separation of the public and the private sphere that led to kind of the relegation of women even more into the role of nurturer rather than provider. So, are we free to pick anybody we want in society? Can you marry just anybody you want to in society? Leaving aside the debate over same-sex relationships, which we're going to address later, and by now you should have realized I'm a fairly liberal person. I believe same-sex marriage should be legal. There's no problems with it. It's not going to contribute to the degradation and destruction of the family as a social unit. That's my own personal belief. However, we're going to talk about that debate later because there are different theoretical perspectives on that, and different views from political ideologies in society on that. But when we talk about mate selection, assuming that we're just talking about selecting somebody with whom to reproduce, same-sex couples don't really play into that. They may choose to have children, but in that case, they will need a surrogate of some kind or another. They will either need a sperm donor or an egg donor. So when we talk about mate selection, if we're talking about a heterosexual couple, are we free to choose anybody we want in society? Think about it for a second. If you say yes, well, okay, how about if you want to choose a 10-year-old as your mate in society? Are you free to do that? No. So there are some restrictions on what we can do. Couple of the ways we can view this, endogamy. Endogamy is the restriction or tendency to select a mate from a specific group. We have specific ages. As far as endogamous selection, you both have to be adults. That's really the only legal restriction we have. But certain religious groups will specify that you have to select a mate from the same religion. In traditional Catholicism, if you want to get married in a Catholic church, both participants have to be Catholic. If you want, Church of Latter-day Saints is the similar. We find a lot of religious endogamy restrictions on mate selection. I believe in the Jewish temple, like in the very, very conservative fundamentalist Jewish temples, both partners have to be Jewish in order to get married within the temple. And traditionally there were prohibitions. The Jewish person would be told you cannot marry one of the goyim, the Gentiles, the non-Jewish. Church of Latter-day Saints, you can marry outside, but you cannot then get married in the temple, and your spouse will never be permitted to come into the temple. Catholicism, it's not prohibited anymore, but you cannot have a Catholic wedding unless you marry endogamously with respect to religion. Now, with respect to race, there used to be what were called miscegenation laws, which restricted mixed race or interracial marriages. The opposite of endogamy is exogamy, and this is the restriction that you have to marry outside of a group. You find exogamous restrictions on marriage in tribal or clan societies because tribe and clan are actually part of that incest taboo, the restriction on who you can select for a mate. There is an assumption that everybody within a particular tribe or everybody within a particular clan are related to each other. And so selecting a mate from within that group becomes incest. It violates the incest taboo. So usually what you will find in societies where you have tribes and clans is the requirement that either all the males or all the females will select a mate from a different tribe or a different clan. And so we talk about exogamy. With regards to our society, you have to marry exogamously with respect to the family. Although, as I said earlier, really the only thing that's like nationwide, federal level, universal about that is no brothers, no sisters, no grandparents, no grandchildren, no parents, no children. The incest taboo, as I said, is one of the cultural universals. Every society has some form of the incest taboo. Now, they are not always the same, and they're not, even where you have an incest taboo in a society, they are not always applied the same on the basis of class. Brothers and sisters shouldn't get married. Close cousins shouldn't get married. And in general, you find that among the lower classes, that will always be prohibited. But when it comes to Royalty, sometimes laws get stretched in order for a family to be able to consolidate its power. If anybody's ever heard of the Habsburg family, it is a family in Europe that is related to just about every ruling house, every monarchy left in Europe. The Habsburgs have married into. I believe the family originated in Austria, and Austria is actually where, after Rome split into the Eastern and Western empires, the Holy Roman Empire, Austria was the headquarters of that right around the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th century A.D. And the Habsburgs were the family that grew out of that, and so they are related to most of the ruling houses of Europe. I've mentioned homogamy as well. Homogamy is conscious or unconscious tendency to select a mate who's similar to you. Like I said, this is not same-sex orientation. This is selecting somebody who might have similar political views, similar degree of religiosity, similar religious affiliation, similar level of education, might be similar racially, might be similar as far as like cultural fads that you enjoy, hobbies, things like that, movies, TV, books, all that kind of stuff. My wife and I share a number of common interests. We both like comic books. We both like role-playing games. In fact, my wife is even an even bigger geek than I am as far as that. She loves like World of Warcraft. And I haven't gotten into that quite as much. I can understand the appeal of it, but I'm more the board type of role gamer. We have similar religious views. We have similar political views. We do have things that are different between us. We actually are an exogamous marriage with regards to class. I come from a middle-class background. She comes from a lower-class background. When we met with regards to education, although she has decided and is finishing up her bachelor's degree now, so there's a lot more parity between our education at this point in time. But we were a little bit different. But really, we had a lot of things similar, a lot of similar interests. We're similar age, which is another thing. You know, you may hear about, you know, the spring-winter romance, spring-fall romance, which is a metaphor for an older person with a younger person. But a lot of times the problems those people face is they don't have commonality of experience, you know. They didn't go through the same fads. They didn't go through the same music, things like that. So sometimes those things can be challenging in a relationship. My wife is only a year younger than I am. So, love. The love relationship. Even in the United States of America, romantic interest as the basis for marriage is a fairly recent phenomenon. We believe that it's kind of culturally, love is the only reason you should get married. And so when we hear arranged marriage, we tend to recoil a bit from that idea. However, for the majority of history, arranged marriages were the norm. People didn't marry for love. They married for other reasons. Parents selected mates for children. Parents would have to approve of mates for children. You know, we still have a remnant of that idea, the idea that, you know, the marriage has to be at least sanctioned by the parents, and the idea of asking, may I have permission to have your daughter's hand in marriage, you know? May I have permission to marry your daughter? And, of course, we're a patriarchal society, so you see the sexism inherent in that, but there had to be parental grace in order for that to happen, and the parents would not approve unless they thought that this was going to be a suitable mate for their child. And, you know, in large part, parental disapproval or approval does still matter, and parental disapproval can even prevent two people sometimes from getting married if it's important enough to them. But we really talk about love, valuing love as the rationale for marriage, and encouraging children to find somebody that they love to marry. Throughout the world, this is not the way things happen. And indeed, throughout history, even in the United States, if you go back 150 years or so, there were still a lot of arranged marriages in the United States of America. And believe it or not, arranged marriages have a lower rate of divorce and a higher rate of success than marriages based on romantic love. Because when the parents arrange a marriage for their children, they're thinking about a host of other factors beyond, are they going to love each other? Class differences. As I said, my wife and I come from different classes. But when we look at it on kind of a societal scale, the upper class, and you know the names, Rockefellers, Gettys, Vanderbilts, Kennedys. There's an emphasis on the heritage of the family there, and whether or not somebody's worthy to marry into that family. There's a larger proportion of single-parent households among lower class. Children are expected to mature earlier and begin to help out, whether it's economically or with tasks around the house. Children have to begin assuming some adult responsibilities. Maybe the older children become babysitters for the younger children. Maybe children become responsible for preparing the meals because the parents at work. And the larger proportion of single-parent households are female-headed as well. In the case of single-parent households, I believe it's somewhere between 85 and 90% of single-parent households are female-headed households. This is becoming less striking. First of all, it's just more and more middle-class households are experiencing divorce as well. And so this is not just a phenomenon. A single-parent household is not just a phenomenon that exists among the lower classes now. So, race and ethnicity also play into families. Even being affluent for minority groups, and I think I discussed this when we were talking about race, even achieving success and becoming affluent does not guarantee an end to discrimination. So the subordinate status of racial and ethnic minorities does affect the family life. We see some differences here because of the overrepresentation of African American males in prison populations. African American males are something like 6% of the total population, yet their estimates have it anywhere between 33 and 50% of the prison population. So they're heavily overrepresented in the prison population. You find a higher percentage of single-parent households in African American communities than you do in the population at large. I want to say 60% versus 45%, but I'm not sure about those numbers. They keep changing so rapidly. So what you see amongst black single mothers is an extended kin network that doesn't just include kinship relations. It actually will include close friends, neighbors, things like that. And this is how they make up for the lack of another parent within the household. They assist each other with food, with babysitting, with childcare, with all kinds of things. And so you see really extended kin networks much more prevalent in African American communities than you do in the population of the U.S. as a whole. Native American families, which really are among some of the most disadvantaged families in U.S. society, especially when we look at what's going on the reservations. They tend to also have networks to try and help out and cushion the blow from hardships that they experience. Amongst the Mexican-American communities and culture, there's a much heavier emphasis placed on family. So when it says they're more familistic, what that means is that the family is very important in the identity of Mexican Americans. What would be called Chicanismo is very important. A family heritage, a family, network, a family, kind of caring for each other is really a part of the self-identity. Chicanismo is that sense of identity for all Mexican Americans. Machismo is specifically the men being able to provide for their families and being able to take care of their families. Sense of virility, personal worth, and pride in one's maleness. And so machismo is Mexican males taking care of their family and having a family. As I said, the Chicanismo, an element of that is the familism, which is pride in that extended family. So, what do families do? Well, they socialize children, right? So parents, important role, important function, socializing children, teaching children proper behavior. Children learn the ideas of proper behavior in society at home first, before they ever really even go out into society. So socialization of children. It's not really what you call anticipatory socialization. From the chapter on socialization, anticipatory socialization happens more when you become an adult, and that's the socialization that you do. Parents may go through anticipatory socialization. Children don't really do that, because anticipatory socialization is the socialization that you go through in your mind preparing for a new role in society. Although oftentimes becoming a parent happens to people with little anticipatory socialization. They just kind of wing it, as you would say. That's why children find so much difference in their experience. The firstborn child may have a greater degree of freedom, may have a greater degree of restriction, but a lot of times the way that the firstborn and succeeding children are raised differs greatly because there is no anticipatory socialization for the role of parenthood. As I said, some parents may go through that. They may read books and try to prepare themselves, but a lot of parents don't, and they just find parenthood kind of thrust upon them. Limited learning during pregnancy. Some people do read books. Other people just kind of worry more about, like, as long as they're healthy and everything's going okay. And then they encounter the challenges of child rearing and child socialization as the child grows up. Abrupt. can be very abrupt. The transition to parenthood can be very abrupt. One minute you have a life, the next minute your entire life is, caring for children. Some of you may have experienced this. Some of you may have experienced friends who have become parents, and all of a sudden your drinking buddy is no longer available to go out drinking as much as, or even at all. Little consensus. We are in the middle of a culture war over certain aspects of how do we produce happy, well-adjusted children. There's a huge debate right now over how much the shape and form of the family affects the outcomes for children. And social research has really only demonstrated that having happy parents, whether it's one parent, two parent, and having a safe, secure environment in the home and in the neighborhood are the only things that social research has really demonstrated contribute to positive outcomes for children. In the Great Recession, which is the recent period this textbook is talking about, a lot of children were having trouble finding work. And so the idea of striking out on your own sometime between 18 and 25 started to fade. And we found more and more children still living with their parents even as they approached 30. So adult children living at home became a phenomenon that we saw increasingly prevalent during the Great Recession, which, kind of began 2007, but this phenomenon extended even back because we went into a period of recession following 9/11. There was a little bit of an economic slump there. So beginning pretty much in the 21st century, we have seen more and more children living at home later and later into their lives, sometimes as much as 30, in even a few cases, even more than 30 years of age before children were leaving, able to find work, leave, and start a life of their own. Or if they did leave, not being able to make it and having to come back. A couple of terms that refer to this are the boomerang generation or full nest syndrome. Okay, I mentioned adoption earlier. It's one of the ways that we can legally establish kinship. And essentially what that does is as you go through the adoption process, you become the legal parent of the child that you adopt. And you have all the rights, responsibilities, and privileges that parents who have children as offspring, as blood offspring, you assume all of the legal rights, responsibilities, and privileges that are granted to those parents as a result of childbirth. Latchkey kids. How many people know what latchkey kid means? I was a latchkey kid from the time I was about probably 12 years of age. Which meant that both my parents were working, and I would come home. I actually had a key to the house. And I would come home and have to unlock the door myself and let myself in and kind of maybe not successfully monitor my behavior to make sure I wasn't getting into too much trouble while my parents were working until about 5, 6 o'clock in the evening. Increasingly, dual income families are becoming the norm in America. Something like 66% of dual parent households are dual income families, and that percentage may even be higher. The figures I'm quoting come from around 2009, so that may even be higher. It may have lowered a bit. It's hard to say. But the idea of the stay-at-home wife and mother as the basis of the traditional family if we look at like Leave It to Beaver, that type of lifestyle really was something that flowered only briefly and only available to middle and upper class families. For working class families and lower class families, the norm has always been that they're dual income families. And prior to World War II, most middle class, there wasn't a huge middle class at that point in time because it was the explosion of industry that provided the middle class lifestyle and a lot of the middle class jobs in the United States of America following World War II. But in an agricultural household, both parents work. Farming, ranching, whatever it is, there's not this idea of mom staying home taking care of the kids, dad goes out to work. That's something when you find, like, as I said, the separation of the public from the private sphere. When you separate the economic center of the home and take it out of the home and put it into the factory, that is when you had the idea that men went to work. And in this country, that happened prevalently following World War II. The idea of being a dual income family is something that's a bit more recent because, like, if you're talking about agriculture, everybody works. My father, who grew up on a farm, actually, and I'm only 2 generations removed from the farm. My father, from somebody who was a farmer for the trade. I'm only 1 generation removed from the farm as far as being a farming family. My father decided he didn't want to be a farmer. But both my grandmother and my grandfather worked. There was no idea of, and it wasn't the idea that, there was only one income. Even though there's only one income, both parents contributed to that income because both parents worked as farmers, both my grandparents. So when we talk about dual income families, and even in urban centers, lower classes, husband, wife, both worked. And prior to child labor laws, even children worked. But dual income families, as I said, well, if you see that, if 95% of the men and 68% of the women, somewhere around 65 to 66% of the households have dual income. So, single parent families, this is where you have only one parent present to care for children. This is becoming an increasing phenomenon that is contributing to what is called the feminization of poverty, because when a family splits up, 90% of the time, the children go with the mother. The majority of income, even though this is beginning to change, usually would rest with the father. 2010, single parent headed about 24% of white families with children under 18. That may be higher at this point in time, but about 60% of African American families are single parent families. 37% of Hispanic families, well, 62%. African American families. And of these, 90% are headed by females. However, that's down from where it used to be. Single fathers are becoming more prevalent in society. Step families, also referred to as blended families, are also becoming increasingly common. Having step siblings, having step children, step parents, and then also having half siblings is becoming increasingly common. That figure, I believe, is actually higher. I believe it's about approximately 50% of people in the U.S. will marry, divorce, and remarry. In fact, in the late 90s, there was actually a phenomenon where people were beginning to refer to their first marriage as their practice marriage. Blended families are a little bit different. There can be resentment harbored because the original family unit is fractured, and a lot of times the children that come, from the new family unit get treated a little bit differently than the children that came from the first family unit. So there's social significance for adults and children. However, again, when we look at what social research has to demonstrate, the well-being of children in step families, like the Brady Bunch, something like that, is no better, on average, than the well-being of children in divorced single-parent households. So there are some social consequences there. As I said, there can be a lot of resentment. There can be a lot of negativity. Oftentimes, children become the kind of message carriers between the parent that remarries and the parent that doesn't. And there can be a lot of acrimonious feelings between those two parents. And a lot of times children will get the brunt of that. Tell your father X, tell your mother X. And so this can lead to some significant psychological dysfunction. In the late 1960s, this was the beginning of kind of the equal rights movement, which one of the things, divorce rates, the reason divorce rates increased in the late 1960s was women lobbied for easier divorces in order to escape domestic abuse. And so you saw the beginnings of divorce due to irreconcilable differences, things like that. Since the late 1980s, it has declined somewhat. Still, the average number of marriages for people in U.S. society who have been married at least once is 2. And something like 50% of all the people that get married in a year will wind up getting divorced at some point in time or another. It had skyrocketed at a certain point in time to where 70% of the people who had gotten married had had at least one divorce. In my family, I have 3 brothers. I married for the first time. My wife was married before we got married. She had been divorced. My brother Drew has been married twice and divorced twice. My brother Chris has been married twice, divorced once. He's still with his second wife. My brother James is married and that was just a recent thing. He's substantially younger than the rest of us. So he actually just got married last year in November. So it's been almost a year for him. But in my family, among my brothers, 50% of us have been divorced. And I know that's not statistically significant, but it does demonstrate a particular trend in society. So, greater social acceptance of divorce, easier to legally obtain a divorce. As I said, you no longer have to demonstrate quite so much cause. And if both partners want the divorce, it actually does not cost what it used to cost in legal fees. If you go to Las Vegas, you can do it through a drive-through. Not only do they have drive-through weddings in Vegas, they have drive-through divorces in Vegas as well. Fewer children, family size has been shrinking. And oftentimes there aren't children associated with the first divorce or with divorce. Greater family income with both parents working. It does not become incumbent upon one family member to remain in what you would call a bad marriage simply because they cannot fend for themselves. And increased participation in the workforce for women and in education as well. Women are actually achieving degrees, both at every level. Women are achieving more degrees than men right now. So there's more educational opportunities that lead to more employment opportunities for women. Really, when we look at the impact of divorce on children, a lot of it has to do with how the divorce plays out. There was a national study found that the behavior before and after divorce did not suffer. This was a national study on over 6,000 children. There are conflicting reports. Some studies have shown that children suffer some behavioral problems as a result of divorce. However, if, as I said, the parents are fighting in the household, if there's constant fighting going on in the household, that leads to behavioral problems in the children as well. So there's some studies have shown greater unhappiness amongst children where the parents have stayed together but are in constant conflict. However, the parental conflict doesn't always end with divorce. So this is a very complex issue. A lot of it has to do with how the children get treated by the parents, regardless of whether or not the parents divorce. A lot of people have foregone marriage for long periods of time. Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. Marriage used to be a huge rite of passage in our society. It was one of the things that kind of was a marker of entering into adulthood. You would start your own household. That's kind of declined. Marriage rates have declined. People are marrying later in life as well. Not so much getting married between 18 and 24. A lot of people are waiting to get married until they're into their 30s and, like in my case, into their 40s. And cohabitation is increasingly prevalent as well. Although you don't escape the responsibilities of marriage just by cohabitating. Most states have what's called common law marriages. Common law marriages essentially say if you set up a relationship that resembles a marriage, you assume the legal duties of that marriage. So cohabitation does not mean that you do not have the responsibilities of marriage. Most states, as cohabitation increased in prevalence, most states have adopted common law marriage legislation. There's conflicting research on whether or not living together is beneficial or actually detrimental to marriage. There is some research indicating that when people live together prior to getting married, the marriage rate drops. The number of people who actually follow through, who get engaged, live together, and then follow through on getting married is lower than people who get engaged and then get married before living together. But then there's also research that indicates that people who live together prior to getting married have happier marriages. Perhaps because of the drop in marriage rate from people living together. People who find out that they're not compatible don't go through with the wedding.
Remaining single. My parents were convinced I was going to be a terminal bachelor. This is also increasing in prevalence in society. As people achieve economic independence, and as women are able to achieve economic independence, they are no longer reliant on marriage to get out of the household. If we go back 100 years, 150 years in time, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman is a social theorist who wrote about this in a book called Women in Economics, women stake their entire economic future on their choice of a husband. And essentially, marriage was the way that women provided for themselves in large part. But economic independence of young people, as I said, primarily women, means that they no longer are forced to get married to leave the household. They have other options now. Getting married without children. An increasing phenomenon. More couples are making that choice, the choice not to have children. They've gone through with the marriage, but they don't really see the need to have children. Marriage is more than just a relationship for reproduction. Lesbian, gay, married couples face a lot of discrimination. Transgendered individuals can experience this as well. Just recently in the news, in a state where there was legislation prohibiting same-sex marriage, a transgendered individual got married. The individual's spouse's family found out about it and posted it on social media, and it kind of created a firestorm of controversy because a lot of people felt that because that person had changed gender, what they had done was essentially flouted the law with regards to the prohibition against same-sex marriage. There are a lot of states that have attempted to discriminate against same-sex marriage. So gay and lesbian couples face discrimination, personal and legal levels. A lot of people feel threatened by the idea of same-sex marriage. They feel it violates what marriage is supposed to be. Marriage is supposed to be between a man and a woman for the purpose of starting a family. Same-sex couples, the assumption is that marriage, from traditional values, the assumption is that if we allow same-sex marriage, it devalues the meaning of marriage. It actually devalues marriage. So when we think about gay marriage, as a society, there's a lot of pressure upon young people to find the perfect mate and get married. If we think about that, we can see that represented in a lot of media, TV shows. How long am I going to have to wait for grandchildren? When are you two going to get married and give me grandchildren? Also, divorce has become more and more acceptable in society. When we think about same-sex marriage, though, we're talking about something that people hold very central in their identity, in their sense of who they are, their sense of self. They're being asked to accept a revised definition of their own self-identity. This may be one of the reasons why some people are so threatened by the idea of same-sex marriage. They may cloak it in religious prohibitions, the idea that they may cloak it in concern for children, but at its core, it's asking people to redefine a part of their essential self-identity. Because when we think about who we are, a lot of times if we're married, that becomes part of who we are in our self-identity. So, a lot of people suggest, well, let's just call them civil unions instead. We'll give them all the same rights, but we won't call it marriage. We'll just have civil unions for them. The problem with that is most states where you have civil unions, the civil unions become a 30 or 40-page document in order to guarantee that all the rights that are in that civil union are the rights that are in the 2-page marriage document, because a lot of those rights are just assumed to be there. So what we've seen, and what we've seen recently, the Supreme Court refused to hear challenges to appellate courts' rulings on state amendments defining marriages between a man and a woman as being unconstitutional, has really made it so that right now there are 30 states where gay marriage is legal, and Indiana is one of them now. And this was because there were about 6 cases the Supreme Court refused to hear, and their refusal meant that you had to rely on the precedent set in appellate courts. Of course, the Supreme Court established the precedent with their ruling on California's Proposition 8, which essentially they said California's Proposition 8 treats citizens of California differently based on sexual orientation. It is therefore unconstitutional. So right now, in the kind of view on gay marriage nationwide, the tide has swung, and there are now more states where gay marriage is legal through court rulings, overturning legislation and ruling legislation unconstitutional. So there are more states now where gay marriage is legal than there are states where it is not legal. There are only 20 states right now. And the reason it hasn't been challenged in those 20 states, I believe. So let's take our theoretical views here, and we've got 3 of them. Functionalists really would say, if we're talking about family, family is about reproducing new members of society. Same-sex couples can't really do that. So marriage is tied to reproduction, and then we will create dysfunction if we begin ignoring the religious views of certain people. We'll create social unrest and social upheaval, which we have seen happen to a certain extent. A lot of people who oppose gay marriage are now beginning to file lawsuits claiming that their right to practice their religion is being infringed upon. Of course, the response to this comes out of the conflict perspective, which is basically saying, yes, you can practice your religion, and if you choose not to support gay marriage, don't marry somebody who's the same sex as you. But by denying gay marriage, you're enforcing second-class status on particular citizens in society, and you are not treating everybody equally in society. You are reinforcing social inequality for same-sex orientation. And so functionalism and conflict are kind of at odds here, and then the interactionist approach really tends to focus mostly on how does coming out and saying you want to marry somebody of the same sex affect your relationship with friends, family, co-workers? How does that have an effect on your life then? So, as I said, at this point in time, it's more than just a trend towards recognition North America. If we look at certain countries, like in England, they have made same-sex marriage legal in the entirety of England. Right now, more than half the states, 3/5 of the states, in fact, I mean, we can break it right down to that. There's 30 states that allow, or that where same-sex marriage is legal. 3/5 of the states in the United States of America, same-sex marriage is now legal. Most states where they've tried to propose some type of amendment have really said, well, we will let you create a domestic relationship, a domestic partnership, a civil union that has all the rights of marriage. We just don't want it called marriage. Indiana was kind of unique in that the proposed constitutional amendment for Indiana essentially would make gay marriage illegal and also make civil unions, domestic partnerships, any kind of legal arrangement between a same-sex couple also illegal. And that kind of failed, and part of the reason that failed was in Indiana, the last statistics I heard, there were about 57% of the people who favored a constitutional amendment defining marriage as between a man and a woman. Yet there was 51% of the population that favored allowing domestic partnerships, legal domestic partnerships between same-sex couples in Indiana. At this point in time, though, right now, the trend has been towards legalizing gay marriage. And I think that that's a trend that we're going to continue to see grow in the United States of America until it is just basically legal at a federal level. Given the recent court decisions, I don't see this going kind of any other way. All right. With that, that concludes our lecture for today on family. We will have our next lecture next Wednesday, which will be it will be November 5th, November 3rd. Let me pull up my calendar here real quick and check. November 5th, I was right the first time. It will be November 5th at 1:30 Central Standard Time, 2:30 Eastern Standard Time. If you would like to attend, I will make arrangements. Email me. My email address is mhowell1@ivytech.edu. Email me, and I will make arrangements to have the link sent out to you.